Well, hello, everyone who's still with us. Thank you so much for being hardcore. As was mentioned, my name is Leah Stokes. I'm a professor at UC Santa Barbara. I work on climate policy full-time. And, you know, it's such an honor to be in a room with so many people who are spending their money, their time, their energy on the most important issue, which is protecting our future, not just for kids, but really for all of us. I happen to be on the East Coast during this week, during these absolutely unprecedented fires in Canada. And, you know, we don't have to look at the future to wonder what climate change is like. It's happening now. And all the work that folks are doing in this room, whether that's donating money or time or getting involved, is really essential. So just want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing on climate change, too. It's not just Ryan and me. It's all of you, too. And it's not just EDC. So, Ryan, it's such an honor to be here with you. Your organization is so visionary. And I wanted to start with a personal question, which is, what brought you to this? I saw an interview that you really wanted to work in the outdoor space and that you really have a passion for the outdoors. So where did that passion come from, and how does that connect with the mission of really working on climate change?
Yeah, thank you. Before I answer that question, let me just say thanks a ton to the EDC for the work you do. Thank you again for everybody and their support. I'll tell you also that I felt like the new kid in town for the last 2+ years, that my family and my son Julian here, who's been bidding on things and ensuring that I'll be working until I'm 85, 90 years old. And my wife Xiaoming and our daughter Nora is somewhere in the dwindling crowd. But I just wanted to say thank you to you all. It's been wonderful to make the move here to Southern California or the Central Coast, and to be able to benefit from the beautiful places that you all have worked so hard to protect. So thank you.
So, the Central Coast is a wonderful place to continue this outdoor journey that you've had for your whole life. But I really wanted to talk to you about, where did this passion for the planet, for the outdoors, really come from on a personal level?
I grew up in Cocoa Beach, Florida. So I grew up on, if you look at a map of Florida, the East Coast, right about in Central Florida, East Side, you see this little tiny bump that is looks like a little growth on the state of Florida. And you can insert your own joke there. But it's probably a 3-minute walk from the front door of our house to the ocean, in about a 30-second walk to like a 3-mile wide river full of dolphins and manatees. And so I feel like I grew up in a place where it was hard not to be really touched by nature, and a place, unfortunately, which will feel very familiar to almost every part of the United States and beyond right now, that's heavily, heavily impacted 50 years later from when I was born. And so whether it's agricultural runoff or it's residential runoff of chemicals on lawns and otherwise, it's incredible how much that area has changed in the time since I grew up there, and very little of that for the better.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that the planet is getting less stable as opposed to more. And Florida really is on the front lines, just like Santa Barbara is in so many ways. So the big news is obviously that last year Patagonia decided to not go public, but go towards purpose. That, you know, the profits are going towards the climate crisis. And, you know, as someone, woohoo, yeah! And I work with a bunch of different nonprofits, and just like EDC, you know, funding can be such a challenge. That's why the donations today are so important. But Patagonia entering this space, I don't think people can appreciate just how much more money will be going to nonprofits on an annual basis. Amazing groups like EDC, but also so many others. So can you talk about some of the inside story of how that decision was made, and what are some of the ripple effects you think it's going to have on environmental activism in this country?
Yeah, I mean, so the inside story, and I've told this one a few times, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn anymore, but you know, I moved into this role in the fall of 2020. I was still based in Amsterdam. I was looking after our business in Europe. It was the middle of COVID. And so I made the move eventually, a number of months later, over to California, still during that COVID period. And so I was meeting with Yvonne and Melinda often over at their house, sitting outside at a pretty good distance. And I remember offices were closed. Business was really we were working pretty hard just to make sure we could get product out and do the things we did. And in classic Yvonne form, what he said is, oh yeah, there's one other thing. If you could figure out the future of the company, just ownership-wise, because we've been wrestling with this for decades, and I think it's now time that we just put this to bed. And I thought, holy shit.
So much for supply chains or, just trying to do basic stuff during a global pandemic. You also need to reform capitalism while you're at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And he thought, I tried to slow walk it and just sort of set it aside and keep working on the other more mundane things. And a week or two later, I came back over and he asked for an update on that. And I said, well, I hadn't gotten to it yet. And he said, I swear to God, I'll go to Vaughn's and find one of those Forbes magazine billionaire lists and start cold calling people if you don't get on this. So, we looked at taking the company public, not for very long. We looked at ESOPs. We looked at, all kinds of different structures that we could pursue, because ultimately the two things that were most important, not just to Yvonne, but to the entire Chenard family, was cash flowing the environment in bigger ways right now, but of equal importance to that was also protecting the integrity of Patagonia and ensuring that it can continue to exist and run according to its values. And so it was pretty quick that we went through those traditional exit strategies and decided none of these were going to be able to do both. And that's when we kind of cobbled together, as it were, a structure that's pretty unique, not entirely unprecedented in Europe, but fairly unique here in the US and not all that scaled in Europe as well, which is we've got one entity that protects the values of Patagonia, make sure that we continue to run according to our principles and philosophies, and the other that's the beneficiary of all of the profits that we make each year.
And so how much money is going to be flowing approximately to environmental groups now?
Yeah, well, the number that Daniel mentioned before is about $150 million in our history via 1% for the planet, over our history of giving via 1% for the planet. So that's about 40 years, almost 40 years, that's accumulated in about 150. We think now we can give in the neighborhood of $100 million a year. So that's what we're looking at.
And if you're working in the environmental nonprofit space like EDC is, that's a game-changing amount of money. That's the kind of thing that can support environmental justice groups. It can support legal centers like EDC. It can support, bedrock environmental groups like NRDC, EDF, et cetera, and also new startups. And I think that, that's huge. And so just really gratitude to you for that work. Money. And I want to ask you, changing the narrative of what business is for. This is really what the heart of this is about. Because, yes, $100 million towards the climate every year is game-changing. But what if other companies started to do this too? What if we didn't view business as extractive and we recognize that really, if we want sustainability, we have to have a livable planet. If we're having millions of people not being able to go outdoors because the fires that are so extreme for days on end, as literally just happened on the eastern seaboard of the United States, how is that good for business? How is that good for people? So how do you think that this change at Patagonia is going to affect other companies and really start to change the narrative around business?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that quite a few of us and a lot of the people in these tables here in the front from Patagonia talk about a lot is, what are we uniquely qualified to impact? What, above and beyond giving money, and $100 million a year is meaningful, but it's not. There's not a story to be written about that. Eco-innovation within product is interesting. Open sourcing it is interesting, but there's not a huge story there. I think what Patagonia, we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary in business and sort of using that moment to ask ourselves, what have we learned? And what do we take forward? And what do we leave behind? And as we wrestle with what's the biggest impact Patagonia has had in its first 50 years, it's not the money it's given away. It's not eco-innovation in apparel. It's not trying to slowly and steadily reset people's relationship with stuff and consumption. It's really about modeling a more responsible version of business and proving, being the social proof that a business can be profitable, can be dynamic, can be growing, and also minimize its footprint and its level of extraction from both people and the planet. And when we think about where the biggest needs are for the next 50 years and where we can be most additive, I think the answer is exactly the same. I think the reality is when we talk about other businesses, it's great to talk with leaders, founders, owners of other businesses and see if there's an opportunity to share best practices and inspire them. I think most of our impact comes through inspiring, educating, and activating their employees and their customers. Because often business leaders and business owners can be counted on to do the right thing when they've exhausted every other option. And so sometimes you've really got to put pressure on them through their customers and through their employees. And that's a big part of what we try to do.
Yeah, I think that that's so powerful. And, you know, it reminds me of the individual story, too. You know, when we ask, what can I do about climate change, which is what I'm going to end us on, we're not there yet. You know, so often, well, we actually did a survey about this recently. Guess what people think, average people, is the number one thing you can do for climate change? Anybody want to take a guess? Recycling! Yeah, you're right. You know what the number two thing is? Eat less meat, which is cool, like I support that, but it's actually not going to totally remove fossil fuels from our energy system, right? So those individual behavior changes, which I do, I recycle, I eat less meat, like I'm with you, but the biggest changes that I have made as an individual is through my activism. You know, I was very involved in helping to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is, you know, billions of dollars of money. And last time I checked, I am not a billionaire. And so I think that story at a corporate level is also mirrored at an individual level, that we sometimes think too small. And if Patagonia had thought smaller, you would have said, let's make eco-friendly apparel, let's have repair. And you do that. But the fact that you thought bigger and you thought about the ripples of change that you can make, I think that's very much mirrored in all of us and what we can do as people too. Yeah, action. So the second thing I wanted to ask about was storytelling. People may know that Patagonia actually makes films and they sponsor films, and you do a lot of storytelling around wild spaces, around the climate crisis. That's another form of cultural change and narrative that can have a really big effect. So I'd love to sort of hear where that comes from in your organization, and what do you think the impact has been of storytelling?
I think storytelling, and more for us, you know, we still do written and printed pieces. We've done something together. We've done things with people that we know in common. But I think some of our most powerful pieces are film. And we've got a brilliant group of storytellers that work within our film department. And I think one of the challenges we have, candidly, is we're just punching out so many films at any given time on so many topics, all of which we think are really important. It's just really trying to ensure that we sort of squeeze as much value out of each of those stories as possible. But I think it's such a fertile ground to take complex topics, frame them for people, and then drive them down to individual people-related or place-related stories. And I think that's an area, you know, I think it goes way back in our lineage with being a catalog business initially and using that medium for long-form storytelling to now, you know, deploying it in filmmaking. But I think it's one of our superpowers.
Yeah, if you haven't seen some of the Patagonia films, they're amazing. I recently saw one called Public Trust from a few years ago, which looked at public lands, extraction on public lands, protection of public lands. It really makes these issues that we're talking about real to people, makes them lived. So it's very powerful work. I'd love to talk locally a little bit about what you're doing in part with the EDC and sort of the protection of Los Padres, an amazing recreation area in our backyard, an amazing forest. I don't know if people go there, but it's awesome. And I'd just love to hear about that kind of activism too, because there's the national, there's the international changing of narratives around business, there's national work. But what about locally in our backyards in Ventura County and Santa Barbara County? Why is that important to Patagonia too?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything happens locally. I think what you have are things that thematically impact the planet, and climate change is a perfect example of that. But you know, there's no intergovernmental body that's going to solve that on its own. And so I think it is foundationally important for us as a business, and it's foundationally important for the people that make up Patagonia. Which, by the way, you know, we're headquartered in Ventura, employed just under 1,000 people there, but we've got roughly that number in Reno, Nevada, and then we've got people on 5 continents around the world, and they're working on preventing new hydropower in the Balkan Peninsula, as they are in Korea, working on creating marine protected areas in Australia, in Japan. So this work is really global, but every bit of it kind of comes down to what's happening in our backyard, whether that truly is 100 meters from where we live, or if it's, you know, within the country and the region that we operate. But that's where the impact happens. For us in Ventura, one of the campaigns that we've gotten involved in recently is trying to prevent SoCalGas from increasing significantly the size of their gas compressor on the avenue in Ventura, which is about 1.5 miles from our headquarters. But more importantly, it's directly across the street from the Girls and Boys Club and an elementary school in a minority dense neighborhood. And it's an area, it's a topic that we're extremely concerned about. And so we've been working with the West Side Alliance for the last couple of years to try to change the outcome there.
Yes, very good. And I will not miss this opportunity to poop on SoCalGas a little bit. SoCalGas was, that I said poop rather than the other one because there's kids in the room. SoCalGas was responsible for the largest gas leak in American history, not very far from here. It affected tons of people for a long time, had huge methane, greenhouse gas pollution impacts. And that'll bring me to my last question, which is the what can I do question. So many people ask all the time, I'm sure you, me, maybe people in the room, what can I do about climate change? And I'm going to give one answer myself, and then I'm going to ask you to share one. What can I do about climate change? Climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels. I say that, maybe that's boring, repetitive, or maybe you forgot, because so often we the story seems so complicated. It's caused by burning fossil fuels, whether that's offshore oil extraction in Santa Barbara or the heating in our own homes. And if you live in Santa Barbara and you have gas in your house, you're paying money to SoCalGas. SoCalGas is, in my opinion, not a great company, and they've run front groups, including in our community, telling people lies to try to stop our city council from taking action, which I thought was terrible. So what can you do? You don't have to use gas in your homes. You can electrify your home. This is something I want to challenge people to do in this community. Cut the cord with SoCalGas. You can get a heat pump. You know what's cool about a heat pump? It both heats and cools your home. You can, of course, get an electric vehicle. You can get solar panels, all that other stuff. But actually removing fossil gas, cutting the cord with SoCalGas is something that I would love to challenge people in this room to say that when you come back to this amazing event next year that you've done, and I'm at the very tail end of doing that myself. I just have to call up SoCalGas this week and ask them to take the meter, and I think you'll feel really empowered if you do that. So that's one action I'm leaving you all with. And Ryan, what about you?
Well, I was going to ask you first, where are you going to tell them to put the meter?
There's kids here, Ryan. There's kids. It's family-friendly audience.
Got it. I think maybe I'll offer two things. One is policy, and you spoke about that before, but I think really, and it feels like it's pushing on an open door in a room like this, but I think it's really finding every opportunity to engage in driving policy, supporting the people that are getting it right and fighting against those that aren't. I think the other is in the business sector. We're unapologetically a for-profit business, and we're not focused on the for-profit piece because we're trying to make as much money as we can. We give it all away now under this new structure. It's instead to operate from the business sector and either inspire or drag them kicking and screaming, because we're not an extension of government. We're not part of civil society. We're a business, and that sector is responsible for a disproportionate amount of what's wrong and the impact that we're all experiencing in the climate, the environmental, and the ecological crisis. And so I would really encourage people to think about the companies that you do business with.
I love it. Well, with that, please join me in thanking Ryan and the amazing Patagonia, which has done such amazing work this year. Yay to Patagonia!